Good evening. On behalf of the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust and the International Center for Ethnic Studies, I would like to warmly welcome all of you to today's lecture and presentation. I'm here in Matisha and I'll be our host for the evening. Late last year, in November, the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust organized a series of lectures on Martin Wickramasinghe. The main objective of those lectures were to introduce and to present Martin Wickramasinghe as more than just a writer or a novelist of fiction. This is the fifth lecture in that series, and now, without further ado, I'd like to invite Ambassador retired Mr. Ravinatha, Executive Director of the Regional Center for Strategic Studies, to deliver the opening remarks.
Thank you very much, Uditha, for inviting me to say a few words. I was told to welcome and introduce, but I see no need to introduce either Uditha or Martin Wickramasinghe to this audience. However, I think I want to commend the effort Uditha has taken, as he has been in projecting several important figures in Sri Lanka in recent times, in drawing attention to and going back and making us appreciate the past a little more. At the time we are so caught up in the present and not trying to connect too much the past and the present. Now, just to give a few words to those of you who are not familiar with the author Uditha, he is an independent researcher, author, columnist and analyst from Sri Lanka, whose work spans various interests, including international relations, geopolitics, arts and culture, history, anthropology, and politics. He holds an LLB from the University of London and a postgraduate diploma in international relations from the BCIS. And it's in that latter capacity that I first got to know Uditha, because he ventured into doing his dissertation on Central Asia. And I found in that Uditha always wanting to do something outside the ordinary, or to interpret something which is looked at in a very common sense, straightforward way, by going behind and trying to unravel some mystery about it. And for that I have great admiration for his work. This lecture series on Martin Wickramasinghe follows his work on George Keith, which he did with Uditha Devapriya. Then he also did a biography on Ravindra Randenia, K. Chokshi, and also wrote about uplifting the legal education in Sri Lanka, 150 years of Sri Lanka's law college. So I'm always amazed when I see Uditha write and talk and do things, how he finds the time to do that. But I think the results of it is very helpful. I want to, since most of those here know Martin Wickramasinghe well, I don't intend to talk about Martin Wickramasinghe. I see Martin Wickramasinghe naturally, like all of you did as kids, from Madhul and the books he wrote. But I have been also, particularly in recent times, I don't know how many of you have visited the museum in the last 10 years. Okay, we were together that time as well. I really commend that you make a trip out there, because, and I brought for you a little booklet, I don't know, pass it on, and I have no contract with the Martin Wickramasinghe family to promote this, but I thought that we are missing out on something, and our children particularly. Those days, when there was no highway, parents could persuade, force, whatever word you want to use, to stop there and go in. Now you can't, because you rarely pass unless you are in Kokkala or somewhere thereabouts. But I found, that was a good morning well spent, because number one, the foundation has done a great job in bringing the culture back there. And also I think it is educative and it's presented in an interesting way to different audiences. There is something for everybody, whichever way you look at it. But I was sad to find that the attention to the museum, particularly from the foreigners, who are very much in that area, and there are a lot of Russian and those former Eastern European tourists who come, because these books were translated into those languages, and therefore Martin Wickramasinghe is not unknown to them. But I feel that besides our attention to Martin Wickramasinghe as the literary person, his role as a public intellectual in very controversial times, he spoke of culture, politics, economics, religion, and he got into trouble for doing these things. But nevertheless, he used his pen and was very known for that. And also probably in his times as an internationalist. Very often the attention of being internationalist was and continues to be in either in politics or in governance. But here's a person outside that sphere who made his own connections, made his own linkages with the world outside, and developed, I would dare say, a kind of parallel network. At a time there was no civil society activists or that kind of networking in that period. So I think what is lovely about Kokkala, the museum, is that they have preserved all those facets in that museum. And having visited a few museums, whether it's a Van Gogh or a Picasso, when you go to this place, you get into that period. And I think that is something which is worth remembering. And I think one great thing which the attention Uditha has been bringing to Martin Wickramasinghe would be to kind of shine the light on that, because it is not only Martin Wickramasinghe you are learning about that period of Sri Lanka, a period which there was a struggle, and how you fought these, how it has to be done in a delicate way, the internal dynamics, all that was there at the time. So I think it is a very the challenge Uditha has taken on behalf of all of us Sri Lankans to make Martin Wickramasinghe more relatable is very important, and for that I commend him. And I think all of us should spend a little time and thought as to how we do more with this asset we have, both of a person and as an institution which is set up, and try and get the messages which he tried to create across. So with that I will stop, and I hope, I look forward to hearing Uditha's thoughts. I've heard this lecture once or twice, but each time he keeps changing some of the dimensions. Let's see what he's going to do with it today. But I'm sure all of you are going to have a well spent evening. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Singh, for those wonderful remarks. And now I have the privilege of inviting Mr. Uditha Devapriya to deliver today's presentation. Uditha is an independent writer, researcher, and an analyst affiliated with the Martin Wickramasinghe Trust. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Uditha Devapriya.
Thank you, Begun. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm gratified to see a full house in front of me. And I'm grateful to you all, above everything, for making the time on a busy Friday evening to come and listen to my lecture. Hirun introduced me as best as he could, which is to say that he introduced me better than I ever could. So I will skip a lengthy introduction, and I will also thank Mr. R. Singh for his very effusive comments in the opening remarks. The Koggala Folk Museum, located around 15 kilometers from the southern coastal village of Galle in Sri Lanka, stands as one of the largest museums and collections of cultural artifacts in this country. It is a popular destination for school children and tourists. On weekdays, the parking area is almost always occupied by buses, hired by schools across the country for field trips. Tickets are very affordable for both locals and foreigners. Depending on the time you have, a complete tour would take you anywhere between 30 minutes to half a day. The museum is divided into various sections, one seamlessly giving way to another. Each revolves around specific areas, themes, and items. From images of Buddha statues, to temple murals, to clay pots, kitchen implements, masks, puppets, and costumes, all the way to boats, bullock carts, and fishing equipment. They provide a visual glimpse into the patterns of life in the 18th and 19th century, specifically southern province of Sri Lanka. Taken together, they constitute elements of the folk culture from that period in our country's history. It is towards the end of the tour that one comes across a house. From a distance, it looks no different to any other rural middle-class home from that period. Outside, an old colonial period couch offers a refuge from the heat of the sun. Inside, a narrow passageway leads to a small courtyard in the center. The house connects to a gallery of photographs, posters, and other paraphernalia. This is the house where Martin Wickramasinghe lived. Born 10 years before the turn of the 20th century, Martin Wickramasinghe was one of the leading writers and novelists of his time and of all time in Sri Lanka. Through 13 novels, several short stories, and countless volumes of essays on a number of subjects, he became the preeminent public intellectual and contrarian mind in the country. In terms of the themes that he tackled in his writings, Wickramasinghe was by all accounts a polymath. Through his interventions as a critic, journalist, and then public intellectual, he made a considerable contribution to public discourses in the country both before and after independence. Though not an artist in any conventional sense, he was very much a modernist in his work and by conviction. This enabled him to absorb numerous influences while forming independent ideas. He wrote on many themes and many topics. These ranged from art and culture, literature and language, history and society, even geopolitics and art history. Prolific to a fault, his output was considerable. Towards the latter part of his life, he was writing to almost every newspaper of note in the country, both in his home language Sinhala and in English. Many of these essays were later collected into volumes and collections, focusing on specific themes from culture to art to politics. And yet, despite these interventions, in Sri Lanka and even abroad, Wickramasinghe remains, at best, a novelist and a writer of fiction. Perhaps the most popular and well-known of his novels is Madol Duwa, an adventure story which has vague echoes of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn.
Wickramasinghe is apparently not as moralistic as other Sri Lankan writers of the period were. He is depicting some of the sweet aspects of rural village life in the book, but he is not overly didactic. He builds in central criticism of the hypocrisies of village life, the tedious and long religious observations, the dullness and uselessness of school for active, imaginative boys, the undue respect and privilege that the well-to-do enjoy.
Madol Duwa proved to be a massive success upon its first publication. Of course, not everyone was taken in by the story. Some felt, perhaps not unjustifiably, that it would incite rebellion among the youth, a terrifying prospect, no doubt, for conservative elders.
About 20 years ago, one of my popular novels which caught the imagination of boys and girls was prescribed as literary text for the SSC examination. It was reprinted 18 times. Yet, certain learned Buddhist monks and lay moralists said that the book was not suitable for students. They took objection to the detailed and fascinating descriptions of catching fish by rod and throw-ins, which they believed should not be read by Buddhist students.
Trailing behind Madol Duwa, though certainly not second in importance to it, is the Koggala trilogy, Gamperaliya, Kaliyugaya and Yugantaya. These two, in particular Gamperaliya, are prescribed texts and are seen as landmarks in Sinhala literature. To quote one of our foremost critics, a contemporary of Wickramasinghe,
for the first time in Sinhalese fiction, we find the language of common speech being used for dialogue. It invests the common conversation with a liveliness and verisimilitude which is impossible of attainment with the literary language.
Quite apart from their literary merits or demerits, the Koggala trilogy charted an important phase in Sri Lanka's modern history, the transformation of colonial society in late 19th and early 20th century Sri Lanka or Ceylon. These are described in detail and at length in these three novels. In many passages, the deterioration of the old order and the rise of new social formations are underpinned by a vividness which was not to be seen in the Sri Lankan and Sinhala literature at the time. Important and relevant though these are, Wickramasinghe's novels, and by extension his fiction, have tended to eclipse his other achievements. After publishing his first novel in 1914, for instance, he began writing to newspapers. His first article appeared in the leading Sinhala language newspaper of the day in 1916. 4 or 5 years later, he was hired on board the editorial staff of that newspaper. From then on, for the greater part of his life, Wickramasinghe remained in constant contact with the press. In the 1930s and 1940s, he began writing extensively in English. This gave him space and freedom to comment on Sri Lankan art, culture, history, society and politics, and communicate what he felt and thought to a wider audience beyond Sri Lanka. Among the topics he wrote so much on was anthropology. My presentation today will delve into his writings on this subject. I will argue that Wickramasinghe's interest in anthropology was shaped first by his early encounters in his village in the southern province of Sri Lanka, and second, by his experiences in Colombo, where he moved to in 1906. In this presentation, I will locate his interest in and writings on this subject in developments that took place in the disciplines of social science and anthropology in the late 19th century. My argument is that Wickramasinghe was a critic of what in anthropological discourses are called evolutionist and diffusionist views of culture, which were prevalent among colonial and local writers and scholars. My hypothesis is that his critique enabled him to become the first, if not anthropologist, then proto-anthropologist in Sri Lanka, with a very eclectic view of culture. Before everything, of course, it is important to understand who Wickramasinghe was and where he came from. Broadly, there are two sources which tell us much about Wickramasinghe's early life. The first, Apegama, captures his childhood in a series of vignettes. The second, Upandasita, is an autobiography published to much acclaim in 1961. Both Apegama and Upandasita, especially the latter, give us important insights into not just Wickramasinghe's childhood and upbringing, but also the society he came from and how it was evolving at a time of deep, one could say, perpetual transformation in the country. Martin Wickramasinghe was born on the 29th of May, 1890 in Koggala, a coastal village in Sri Lanka's southern province. Koggala was located around 15 miles from Galle, 15 kilometers or so from Galle. Galle had gained a prominent place in the early decades of British colonial rule on account of its harbour and its commercial life. By the time Wickramasinghe was born, however, things had begun to change. The Colombo harbour was growing in importance, and the prestige Galle had once commanded was beginning to die down. It was this world in the opening of Gamperelia which Wickramasinghe describes in vivid detail.
There is hardly a place in Ceylon which, in connection with European occupation, possesses so much interest and offers such a fruitful field for the study of the more recent history of this island as the sleepy little town of Galle.
To be sure, of course, contrary to what this particular writer said, Galle was hardly sleepy or little socially or economically. By the late 19th century, in terms of revenues, it was leading the southern province and the other two districts in the region, Matara and Hambantota, by leaps and bounds. At the same time, by the middle of the 19th century, the southern belt of Sri Lanka had become an epicenter of a cultural and religious revival. As the historian Kitsiri Malalgoda has noted, Galle became the hub of this revival, particularly after the arrival of a group of theosophists in 1880. Conversely, it also became an epicenter of Christian missionary education. In other words, Galle was a region where modernity and revival coexisted.
The village of Koggala lies in a long stretch of land bounded on one side by the Indian Ocean and on the other side by the Koggala, the beautiful white river. The smooth black ribbon of road linking the southern towns of Galle and Matara runs between the village and the sea. Tall coconut palms, trees and shrubs abound in every garden.
Sorry for that. It was essentially this world that became Wickramasinghe's inheritance. Martin Wickramasinghe was the only son in a family of 8 daughters. Members of his family, including his father and uncle, served as police and minor officials, working within a vast network of administrators. In his memoirs, he remembers his father as a man of very few words. At first, Wickramasinghe was sent to a Guru Nanse or village teacher from whom he learned to read. Then he was sent to the village temple, the Sudarshanarama, where he studied under a monk, Malalagama Koggala Dhirananda. Dhirananda Thera proved to be an adept teacher. He also happened to be a cousin of Wickramasinghe. He had graduated with high honours from Vidyodaya Pirivena, one of the two great monastic seats of learning in the maritime provinces of the Low Country, and was proficient not just in Sinhala, Pali and Sanskrit, but also in English. Over time, he would become not just a teacher to Wickramasinghe, but also a guide and an advisor. From the temple, he proceeded to 3 schools for his formal education. The first of these was Buena Vista. Established by the Anglican Society for the Propagation of the Gospel, Buena Vista was located in Rumassala, Unavattuna, around 10 miles or so from Koggala. Today, Unavattuna is a tourist hub, famous for its jungle beaches. In Upandasita, Wickramasinghe reminisces, walking around the area, exploring, foraging and discovering, excursions which would spark an interest in biology and evolution.
Twice or thrice a week, after school was over, I went to the Rumasala forest. I was vaguely certain there were lions in Rumasala. I also felt there was something heroically wandering around the jungle in Rumasala.
As you can see, these were impressions which bore deeply on Wickramasinghe's mind. Sorry for that. From Buena Vista, Wickramasinghe proceeded to 2 more schools, situated in Ahangama, a village which bordered on Koggala. The first of them was a Sinhala school and the second an English one. In the English school, Wickramasinghe came across a different, almost foreign environment, a westernized atmosphere he could not relate to.
The headmaster, who had grown in Colombo, knew nothing of the beliefs or villages. He did not know of their poverty. There were times when Amma phoned my sister's jewelry in order to buy English books that I needed.
Far from upsetting or daunting him, however, such encounters made Wickramasinghe more sensitive to the different cultures in his village. These helped him probe deeply into his society, into the relationships and stratifications undergirding it. Indeed, Upandasita is full of humorous anecdotes about the social and class structures in Koggala. As villagers rose up the social ladder and became more affluent, they would adopt Western names and habits. Though they did this to enhance their respectability at a time when Westernization and Europeanization were seen as pathways to progress, they ended up becoming the subject of countless jokes among poorer villagers.
The villagers started giving their children these new English names. This is how the village became filled with people who had funny English names. A person in our village who had educated relatives in Boer named his son Edward Bruce. The villagers, for the convenience of pronunciation, turned it into Bruce, boiling with anger and embarrassment. The villager renamed his son. Francis became Francis, Abraham became Abraham, Gregory, Gregoris, Herman became Harmanis, and later Harvard.
Sometimes, ladies and gentlemen, these anecdotes could become quite scatological.
One day I overheard a conversation between my sisters and 2 middle-class girls who had come home. The conversation at one point touched on the matter of soup. The women from influential families in Vatican don't use soap when they wash their faces anymore. One girl said, "Why not? Everyone in the village uses soap, even the servant woman." About a week after this conversation, my sisters began washing their faces without soap.
In the last few years of the 19th century, the southern province experienced what could be described as a boom. Almost overnight, rubber and tea plantations faced an upsurge.
This was a period of prosperity not only for tea, rubber, and coconut planters, but also liquor vendors, distillers, produce merchants, transport agents, and traders, as well as large and small owners of land.
Yet there was a constant mismatch between economic growth, educational revival, and the lack of employment opportunities in the region. For many people, an education in English, indeed any education beyond the elementary stage, became a passport to the metropolis, which then as now in Sri Lanka was Colombo.
There were few avenues of employment for Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslim youth who were educated out of their class. As a result, those who came had to make a shift to Colombo for employment, only returning to the village on reasonable occasions.
Martin Wickramasinghe did not prove to be an exception to these developments. In Upandasita, he alludes to the death of his father. He was only 8 at the time. Less than 10 years or so later, Wickramasinghe made his way to Colombo in search of employment. Despite being a promising student at home, he was compelled to abort his education. Whatever ambitions he would have harbored for himself, these were all put to the back burner. Not surprisingly, in Colombo, he became a different man. The sequel to Wickramasinghe's growing up in Koggala was his maturing in Colombo. Initially, he found a job as an assistant in a shop. Later, after the Sinhala Muslim riots of 1915, he and a kinsman or a relative of his travelled to Batiklo, where they set up and ran a shop. Nearly 20 years later, Wickramasinghe began, nearly 2 years later rather, Wickramasinghe began writing to newspapers on topics like science and biology, and found a job as at the leading Sri Lankan newspaper of its time, the Dinamina. Sorry for that. Lacking formal education and earning a modest salary, Wickramasinghe spent the bulk of his income on books. The Martin Wickramasinghe collection at the National Library in Colombo has a full catalogue, more than 5,000 titles to be exact. Yet there were other books and journals that he read, either by purchasing them outright or borrowing them from friends, which are not in the catalogue. Wickramasinghe refers to these in Upandasita. It is these books which sparked his interest later on in anthropology.
Although I was not able to grasp Edward Close, the story of creation in the first reading, the illustrations stimulated me greatly. It was not difficult to understand Dennis's easy outline of evolution. It was these two books which cast light into the biological world, where my activities had either to be nerdy to grow up in the dark.
Passages like these suggest that in Colombo, his childhood interest in biology, in the natural world, and thereafter in evolution pushed him to read more serious subjects and emboldened him to master them. To be sure, although Colombo could not have been more different to Gaul, Wickramasinghe related to it and found a home of sorts there. Befriending migrant workers from other parts of the country, booksellers, street hawkers, Buddhist monks, and the like, he became receptive to the rich tapestries of social class in the city. The shop he worked at was located in Banksall Street. This was near the fort or the Peta.
On the other side of Banksall Street was a street called Reclamation Road. White people and sailors disembarking from the ships often went down this road in rickshaws. Rich Sinhalese did not sight this place during the day. It was only at night that they would venture on this road and take dress to kill and highly perfumed.
A rather suggestive tone of voice. In 1914, Martin Wickramasinghe published his first novel, Leela. In his memoirs, he admits that the book sold lukewarmly and was received as lukewarmly by critics. At the time, he had formed somewhat contrarian and critical views on subjects like Buddhism. These views found their way to Leela, where he formulated a critique of custom and tradition that led one reviewer, rather dubiously, to describe Wickramasinghe as a Christian. This, incidentally, was at a time when the English-speaking, English-educated Christian elite were widely seen as an almost parasitical social class in Ceylon.
In attacking certain customs and beliefs bound up with the practice of Buddhism, Wickramasinghe may have created the unfortunate impression of attacking the religion itself. But you careful reader of Leela, it out to be clear that what the author was attacking were the numerous superstitions indulged in by the village folk and even educated persons in the belief that they had the sanction of custom.
In other words, Wickramasinghe's attitude to Buddhism and to the society he had hailed from was evolving and becoming more radical. This is an important point to register in the context of the time he was writing Leela. By the end of the 19th century, the Buddhist revival had flourished in and more or less permeated the southern province of the country. It then rapidly made its way to other parts of the country, including Colombo. As several scholars have noted, the Buddhist revival produced two somewhat divergent ideological strands. One of these was a critical and somewhat rigid attitude to Buddhism, whereby superstitions and cultural rites, alien or non-indigenous, quote unquote, to the faith, were dismissed as superficial and foreign. It was from this standpoint that Wickramasinghe mounted his critique in Leela and offered an alternative, scientific, rationalist interpretation of Buddhism, which was to evolve over time. This is interesting and quite contrarian for its time, because Wickramasinghe himself had emerged from a world and a culture which was, by definition, hybrid. But such attitudes were not specific to Wickramasinghe. 14 years after he wrote and published Leela, a contemporary of his from Gaul, A.P. de Souza, would expand on this critique in a dissertation to the University of London.
There have been imperceptible adaptations of Hindu rites in social ceremonies such as marriages, cures affected by charms. And according to astrology, horoscopy, physiognomy, and palmistry and its non-Buddhist practices are direct adaptations of the Hindu system.
Colombo, ladies and gentlemen, became a crucible of learning, and more correctly, for Wickramasinghe, self-learning. In 1916, he poured his thoughts into the first of many newspaper articles. From then until 1921, when he joined the Dinamina, he explored topics like culture and society and science from radical and almost contrarian viewpoints. The Sinhala Muslim riots of 1915 briefly interrupted Wickramasinghe's work. 3 years later, he and a relative of his opened and ran a shop in Batticaloa, a synthesis between different faiths on the one hand and between religion and science on the other. Yet all of them, these two writers included, were associated with journals, highly radical and rationalist literary journals, which influenced Wickramasinghe. These included Open Court, The Monist, and the Rationalist Press Association. That Wickramasinghe read anthropology through these platforms and outlets is borne out by a perusal of his personal collection of books. Among these, there are two seminal texts on anthropology: Alfred Haddon's History of Anthropology and Edward Tyler's Religion in Primitive Culture. We know from the catalogue that both of these, at least the editions which Wickramasinghe purchased, were published by Watts and Co. Watts and Co. was one of not many publishing houses founded in mid-19th century England which advanced the cause of secular and rationalist thought in the country and the continent. Indeed, it seems to have published a great many of the books in Wickramasinghe's collection. In my opinion, this points somewhat to a connection between his reading of rationalist texts and his later immersion into anthropology, a point which I believe is well worth researching. His second point, the second point I would like to make, is that Wickramasinghe began reading anthropological texts at a time of tremendous development and transformation in the social sciences. Martin Wickramasinghe's collection contains books by a vast number of anthropologists who went on to define and redefine the field in early 20th century Europe and the West in general. These include Bronislaw Malinowski, Ruth Benedict, Margaret Mead, Franz Boas, and James Fraser, all of whose texts can be found in Wickramasinghe's collection. It is important to note where anthropology stood by the time Wickramasinghe came across these texts in his formative years. Throughout much of the 19th century, anthropology had been accepted as little more than armchair scholarship. There were dubious convergences between the subject and the aims of colonialism.
Racism played a distinctly central role in another rapidly developing social science, anthropology. If some existing races could be shown to be closer to the apes than others, would this not prove their inferiority? The argument is feeble, but it had a natural appeal to those who wanted to prove racial inferiority.
At the turn of the 20th century, there were two schools of anthropological thought, broadly, which dominated but had increasingly come under attack: evolutionism and diffusionism. Both were influenced by the colonial attitudes of the day, and both held that some cultures were inherently superior to others, in the case of the evolutionist school, or that they were at best replicas or imitations of higher cultures, as with the diffusionist school. Writing of the art historian Ananda Kumaraswamy many decades later, Senaka Bandaranayake noted how pervasive these views had become in the early 20th century. As you can see from this quotation, these views had permeated not just South Asia, but also Southeast Asia, and by extension, Asia. What is important to note is that Wickramasinghe was very much influenced by later anthropologists, including Malinowski, Ruth Benedict, and Margaret Mead, who broke with these arguments. He was particularly critical of scholars who viewed Sinhalese culture as a replica of Indian society, though he made the case for parallels between these two civilizations. He was also critical of those who went to the other extreme and conjured up visions of totally indigenous pasts.
There are some visionalists who, having accepted the point of view that our culture is a copious one, think is derogatory to us. But they hope by insisting on this point to preserve the indigenous culture from indiscriminate westernization, to which they fear it is exposed from all sides. Others wish to overcome the stigma of such an account of our culture by inventing for the Sinhalese hypothetical ancestors who lived nearly 20,000 years ago and founded one of the greatest civilizations ever.
I'm sure, ladies and gentlemen, that you can trace, as I do, the sarcasm in these lines. Eventually, these articles helped Wickramasinghe frame the culture which had been his inheritance in Koggala and the southern province of Sri Lanka as more than just a replica.
His work in this direction proved that Sinhala culture was as perfectly valid an object of study as any other rural traditional society in the world of his time.
The third and perhaps most important point that I can raise with regard to Wickramasinghe's writings on anthropology is that he viewed a society's ability to adopt and adapt as a sign of its strength. In this, he was very much opposed to those who either ranked such societies lowly for its lack of originality, or, as his critic of myth-making shows, those who romanticized their past to the extent of denying the external influences and aspects of those societies.
Some of our nationalists present the assertion that Sinhalese culture is made up of and developed from elements borrowed and re-adapted. The re-adaptation of foreign elements is a sign of originality and virility of a given culture rather than a weakness.
This point is important because Wickramasinghe clearly saw the fluidity of cultures, their ability to absorb other influences as a basis for pluralism and tolerance. It is this which made him valorize folk culture, and by extension anthropology itself, as a tool for empathy and understanding across different societies. Speaking of the mass culture of Sri Lanka and the southern province, for instance, he argued that
the real-world humor and sarcasm of some of the mass would hurt the susceptibilities of hypersensitive townsmen. But like the folk tales, they are correctives too and criticisms of ways of our living and thinking.
Writing many years later, the anthropologist Gananath Obesekara echoed this point.
Thus, the great life stories of the Buddha, the Jatakas, tended to be rejected or ignored as folk tales meant for the edification of an ignorant populace, and not as a repository of Buddhist ethics and morality.
In other words, in the slow decay of folk culture, both Wickramasinghe and Obesekara after him saw the loss of certain vital correctives which had insulated people from violence. To be sure, whether Martin Wickramasinghe was overly optimistic about the progressive potential of folk culture is open to debate. What is clear is that such aspects of culture, in his view, insulated human beings from violent tendencies and promoted understanding. This is a view which animated his thinking until his passing away in 1976. Indeed, and with this point I shall round up my presentation, it may have been his most seminal contribution, both to our understanding of culture and to anthropological discourses in general in Sri Lanka. Rooted in the traditions and in the ways of seeing, living and believing of his country, Martin Wickramasinghe broke with the conventional attitudes of his day. In doing so, he became a powerful shaper of public discourse, who made it clear that one cannot become a public intellectual without reaching the public. It is from this critical standpoint that we must approach Wickramasinghe, going well beyond the literary framework within which, for 50 years, we continue to define. Thank you.